The American Enterprise Institute presents the Distinguished Lecture Series on the Bicentennial of the United States. Our host for this thought-provoking series is Vermont Royster, Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist with the Wall Street Journal and professor of journalism and public affairs at the University of North Carolina.
I'm Vermont Royster with another in the American Enterprise Institute series of distinguished lectures on the American bicentennial. To help study and celebrate the 200th anniversary of the United States, the AEI has gathered some of the nation's leading scholars and educators to share with us their views on the American Revolution and how it still affects us all today. The Distinguished Lecture Series is a part of the AEI's continuing effort to open the major issues of our times to serious discussion from several points of view. The AEI is a nonprofit, nonpartisan institution located in Washington, D.C. Today's lecture by Dr. Forrest Pogue takes place in one of the most historic of all American locations, the United States Military Academy at West Point, New York. Duty, honor, country. These are the watchwords at the Military Academy, and throughout some of the darkest days of America's history, these words have guided the lives of Academy graduates with names like Grant and Lee, and Pershing and MacArthur and Eisenhower. And by guiding the lives of these men, the Academy has in some measure helped to shape the lives of all Americans. Today, some 4,500 cadets give the Military Academy a pulsing, dizzy pace that never seems to let down. West Point today presents quite a contrast from the scene in 1802 when Congress created the Academy under Thomas Jefferson's presidency. 5 officers and 10 cadets were then assigned here, and the number of men in the first graduating class was 2. The location of West Point, on a commanding bluff overlooking the Hudson River, makes it a natural site for a military installation. Fortifications were first built in the area in the Revolutionary War days, and George Washington referred to West Point as the Gibraltar of America. The fortifications around the area, plus a giant chain stretched across the Hudson, kept the British from using their sea power to separate New England from the other colonies. Today at West Point, the task is to separate the men from the boys. And it's a sometimes painful process for the 1,200 boys who enter the academy each year. The lives of the new boys are mostly guided by the men of the upper classes. Members of the new class, called plebes, are subjected to a year of intense, unremitting training and discipline. He must be ready for immediate inspection 24 hours a day, and he must spend the better part of the year sitting or standing at attention or running to complete a host of duties. Those who make it become men, upperclassmen, with the responsibility of breaking in a new class of boys. Today, the men of West Point are among those gathered in Thayer Hall to hear our AEI speaker, Forrest Carlisle Pogue, discuss the revolutionary transformation of the art of war. Dr. Pogue is Executive Director of the George C. Marshall Research Foundation. He is introduced by Colonel John S.B. Dick, Acting Dean of the West Point Academic Board.
We feel fortunate that Dr. Pogue has shared much of his knowledge about World War II with our cadets and faculty in the past. Tonight, however, Dr. Pogue will turn the clock back nearly 200 years to talk about the revolutionary transformation of the art of war, stemming from the American Revolution. His subject should be of interest to all students of war, and I am sure that he will inform us, challenge us, and stimulate our thinking about the development of the art of war. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Forrest Pogue.
Tonight, we meet at the river and the rock. This Gibraltar of America, largest fortress of the American Revolution, completed under the eye of General Washington, frustrated British hopes of controlling the Hudson and splitting off the New England colonies from the rest of America. West Point, triumphant even in the face of treason, is a fitting place for an assessment of the change in warfare that accompanied the American and French Revolutionary period, 1775-1801. As we approach the 200th anniversary of the War for Independence, we shall retell myths, legends, and solemn truths. One of the myths of the Revolution is that Frederick the Great of Prussia described the fighting by the forces of Washington around Trenton and Princeton in the period December 25, 1776, and January 4, 1777, as the most brilliant campaign in the history of warfare. This appeared only, as it is said, in Bernard Lossing's 1859 volume on the war, but as time has gone on, it is stated as an absolute fact. It was disproved in a series of scholarly articles around the turn of the century and supposedly finished off conclusively by Major General Francis V. Greene in 1913. But it still, like many other myths, survives. It persists, however, because the great European commander of the period should have praised this as one of the key campaigns of the war. It was the signal that the Continental Army had come of age and was in the war to stay. Lexington, Concord, and Bunker Hill had been unexpected acts of defiance, but they had been followed by poor performances of troops and effective leadership, which had forced American withdrawal with considerable losses from New York to the temporary safety of New Jersey. Almost discredited at Christmas time, Washington faced the fact that most of the members of his Continental Army, weakened and confused, would soon leave him when their terms expired at the end of the year. Cinderella's prospects near the stroke of midnight could not have been more dismal. So the so-called Fabian general, heir to a generation of orthodox military solutions, placed his career and perhaps his life on the line. In an almost hopeless situation, he decided to use his troops while there was yet time. The weather was abominable, the odds extreme, the river virtually impassable because of ice. A more cautious man would, like his opponent, General Cornwallis, have stayed in winter quarters. For his crossing of the Delaware, Washington had the assistance of Captain John Glover's Marblehead Regiment, whose boatmen had already helped to evade the British in the retreat from Long Island. During the cold and stormy night of December 25th, he crossed the river, perhaps not so grandly as Lutzy has portrayed him, but perkily at least, a scene so clearly made for Hollywood that no motion picture of this event has ever been convincing. Shortly after daybreak, the Americans arrived at Trenton to awaken Colonel Rahl and his Hessians. The enemy was surprised, whether because of frivolities of Christmas Eve too long extended, or the customary hard drinking of that commander, and most of the garrison taken prisoners. Slipping back across the river, Washington reformed his troops and returned to Trenton a few days later. Nettled, Cornwallis gathered his forces and declared that he'd trapped the fox. But with stratagems worthy of Ulysses, Washington left his camp fires burning while marching to Princeton for a surprising victory there before the British commander could bring up his troops. With promises of extra pay and perhaps some eloquent persuasion, Washington kept his vanishing Continentals the necessary vital days for a stunning victory. Wars in this era were fought mainly for dynastic reasons. One went to war in the 18th century to prevent the union of two powerful houses, to press a shadowy claim ungallantly on a new crowned queen, to prevent a frontier strong point or a stray duchy from passing into unfriendly hands, or to join one's powerful neighbors in despoiling a weakened colleague. This maneuvering for advantage was not peculiar to Frederick's century, but it seemed that the War of Austrian Succession and the 7 Years' War, no matter how untidy their overseas phases proved to be, were fought for limited objectives. Somewhat more exciting than the hunts, a well-organized campaign accompanied by a social season could occupy the time of officers from the court and test and try the men forced into battle. The fighting was not all that devoid of danger. Disease and exposure could carry off more men than musket fire, but there was the opportunity to execute on the ground the well-sketched designs performed in perfect patterns. Behind this theory of warfare was the careful planning of monarchs of the period. Most armies belonged to the king. In the case of Frederick, a monarch who led his troops in the field, or in the case of England, a monarch who used his powers to control the military forces in uneasy alliance with certain cliques in the Houses of Parliament. Monarchs like Frederick saw their nation's prosperity dependent on the work of artisans and the labor of peasants. They did not wish to lose the labor of producers, nor to place their crops and manufactures at the mercy of men in conflict. So it seemed expedient to take for fighting in the ranks and leadership in the field the men who contributed least to the prosperity of the state. High command was reserved for members of the nobility, and many of the troops were drawn from prisons, from the ranks of the unemployed, or from somewhat better off people who were impressed into service against their will. Once recruited, a process that included men taken in drink, or duped, or even kidnapped, they were made to serve under the lash. Floggings so terrible in both the armies and navies of that time that punishments involving something like 1,000 lashes were sometimes used to keep men in line. By careful drills, repeated interminably, 4 or 5 years of endless exercises to train a proper product, the soldier performed dutifully on the battlefield, firing in well-arranged and well-articulated formations. But such men could not be trusted in long campaigns in foreign lands. Those local contingents were often augmented by a more hapless lot, foreign mercenaries, paid for at so much a head, enriched their princes. They might become attached to their regiment or take a certain pleasure in a campaign well fought, but they had no pride in serving the foreign prince or state. The sovereign treated them with a certain care. One did not willingly damage an expensively trained hireling, nor willingly press an attack on an enemy which could destroy a valuable unit. Campaigns, therefore, did not involve battles to the death, but were restricted to maneuvers for position and for demonstrations of power. There was much to admire in such performances, but they had the same artificial elegance that characterized many paintings of the period. Few things marked the transformation of 18th century warfare more than the later shift away from the use of mercenary troops. The use of foreign troops was not new in Europe. They had been used in the late Middle Ages, the Renaissance, and in the religious wars, shifting from allegiance to allegiance as opportunities dictated, sometimes using their advantage to seize power from the ruler who paid them. Machiavelli, searching for means to bring order to the Italian states, reminded his ideal prince that he must beware of mercenaries. In peace, you are despoiled by them, and in war, by your enemies. The cause of this is they have no love or other motive to keep them in the field beyond a trifling wage, which is not enough to make them die for you. But they still made up a substantial part of the force of 55,000 men that General Sir William Howe insisted he would need to reduce the American rebels to submission, and the reserves that would be required to replace losses imposed by battle casualties, disease, and desertion. Besides the mercenaries, the British could count on seasoned soldiers of British regiments, many of whom had originally been secured like those of other continental powers to which we have alluded. Some American units organized from colonial troops in earlier fighting, and American loyalist units created after the beginning of the Revolution.
Dr. Forrest Carlisle Pogue, one of the nation's leading military historians, has been discussing the revolutionary transformation of the art of war. In just one moment, he will continue his lecture. While names of many West Point graduates are among the most famous in all American history, the most well-known name at the Academy itself is something less than a household word, Sylvanus Thayer. A visitor to the Point might stay at the Thayer Hotel, enter the Academy through the Thayer Gate, and then drive along Thayer Road to the site of today's lecture, Thayer Hall. Thayer became superintendent in 1817 when he was just 32, and the Academy was not much more than a broken, disorganized military school. Almost without assistance, Thayer transformed the Academy into a major educational institution. He also inaugurated the famed West Point honor system. In Thayer Hall today, military historian Forrest Pogue is continuing his lecture on the revolutionary transformation of the art of war.
The Colonial Militia had constituted the fighting forces on the eve of the Revolution. Some form of military service had been a tradition of the British since the days of the Saxons. This concept was brought to American shores by the early settlers and had been nurtured by the requirements placed on frontier communities by the threat of hostile Indians or the aggression of French and Spanish neighbors. Unfortunately, the militia were seldom well led or well trained or well equipped, but they were persuaded of the rightness of their cause just by drilling together. They practiced the art of resistance to England, and they prepared as best they could for the shock of battle. Practically, they stored up powder and other munitions of war and laid plans for protection of their magazines, their homes, and fellow citizens who were already under suspicion or even under ban by the British. Thus, even before the actual confrontation on Lexington Common, there was a revolutionary transformation in the thinking of several colonists concerning the art of war. Beyond the simple service to the Crown, or preparation against local riots, or Indian depredations, serious military resistance to British troops sent to enforce parliamentary decree was now involved. Not yet did the colonists envisage actual independence, but there was in preparation by free men of local forces that would serve American towns and colonies against British coercion. The militia, far from being prepared for real service in the cause of independence, was merely in train of arming for protection of American rights as they saw them. Activity outside the assumptions of the earlier militia and foreign to 18th century European notions of the proper organization of an army. In the initial fighting, the colonists depended on the militia of New England. Shortly before the Battle of Bunker Hill, these forces were adopted by the Continental Congress as the beginnings of the Continental Army. On the same day, June 14, 1775, 10 companies of infantry were authorized to be raised from Virginia, Maryland, and Pennsylvania for Continental Army service. A day later, Washington was selected as commander-in-chief. By fall, it was assumed that a force of slightly more than 20,000 would be satisfactory for 1776. But at the beginning of that year, Washington found the Continental Army to consist of only 8,000 enlistees. It was an indication of what the future would provide. For the remainder of the war, He had to depend on short-term militia to make up the difference between the troops provided and the Continental Army of well-trained men enlisted for long-trained service, which he'd asked for. Washington swore by his Continentals, but more often he swore at the militia. In times of great frustration, he berated the militia as totally hopeless and begged to be relieved of dependence on such useless soldiers. But he recognized that men suddenly summoned from their homes, with only the meager training they had received in occasional drills, could not stand in the face of heavy assaults by trained men. Men unaccustomed to cold steel often broke in the face of British or Hessian charges. Even the Continental soldier, better led and somewhat better trained, was not yet ready for severe tests to fire. Fortunately for the young army, at a critical time, a drill master appeared, son of a Prussian officer who'd also served for a time in the Russian army. Frederick von Steuben, who had gained a captaincy in the Prussian service and for a time a place on Frederick the Great's staff, appeared in Paris seeking military employment abroad. From his service on the staff of an obscure German princeling, he claimed the title of baron and the rank of lieutenant general. Whether or not his sponsors, the French War Minister Saint-Germain and American representatives Benjamin Franklin and Silas Deane, blindly accepted his claims to high rank in the Prussian army or not, they were satisfied that he had knowledge of tactics and drill needed by Washington and were willing to certify his claims in the hope of impressing the members of the Continental Congress, who had become a little weary of high-ranking Europeans who wanted all to be at least major generals when they arrived, although most of them had reached the high rank of captain or major when they came. Soon aware that von Steuben could train men and that he did not consider it beneath his dignity to drill small groups in demonstrations which any American commander could copy and soon pass on to other units, Washington gave him broad powers to prepare a manual of drill regulations which would become standard for the American forces for more than a generation. In itself, there was no great revolutionary transformation involved here, but von Steuben recognized the necessity of simplifying the rules and establishing less complicated maneuvers, more suited to American needs than those used on the battlefields of Europe. In fact, the genius of Washington was seen in his search for better grounding in orthodox European military methods while adapting his tactics to the American soldier and his needs. From the American experience, it became increasingly clear to British leaders that free men, motivated by a desire to protect their homes and to gain a larger degree of independence from overseas rule, could rally after tremendous hardships or overwhelming defeat. The British would find in the wilds of North America, as the French would find later in Spain and Russia, the folly of using conventional methods against a foe fighting in his own hills and swamps and deep forest. A foe who could disappear and then suddenly reappear, strengthened for another attack. Able either to get local supplies or to live off the land, the Americans carried fewer provisions than the British, relying less on vulnerable supply lines, which hampered mobility and made virtually impossible surprise attacks. The European armies would learn the lessons in the Revolutionary Wars in America and Europe, but would have to be reminded of these lessons in later conflicts, even as Americans in our own day have had to find again the cunning which they seem to have had instinctively in an earlier era. It is important for us to recall, in a period when many emergent nations are still engaging in revolutionary or national wars, some of the lessons which the British learned from the Revolutionary Militia of America. John Shy, in an essay written in 1973 on the military conflict as a Revolutionary War, has paid tribute to these often maligned militiamen. The militia, he says, enforced law and maintained order wherever the British did not, and its presence made the movement of smaller British formations dangerous. The militia nullified regularly every British attempt to impose royal British authority short of using massive armed force. From the British viewpoint, the militia was a virtually inexhaustible reservoir of rebel military manpower, and it was also the sand in the gears of the pacification machine. British bewilderment concerning the performance of the militia was second only to their surprise at the capable leadership of the rebel force. It was not unusual in an earlier era to find men from low estate rising to command in times of upheaval. In the Middle Ages, dominated by royalty and the great lords, there had still been a chance for advancement for an able squire or a bright cleric through the army or the church. In time, the higher offices of both were closed almost entirely to all save those of noble birth or those of wealth who could purchase a commission or use their political connections to win high place. A glance, for example, at some of the portraits in the British National Gallery of 18th century adolescents in their splendid colonel's uniforms will underline my point.
Dr. Forrest C. Pogue has been discussing the strategies and tactics that led to victory for the United States in the Revolutionary War. In just one moment, he will continue. There are times at West Point when the cadets can be seen basking in the warm spring sunshine, but those times are rare indeed. Most of the cadets' time is taken up in study and classes, and the excellence of the Academy's academic program is a point of great pride. Cadets receive courses in such fields as humanities, social sciences, mathematics, science, and engineering, and graduation from West Point leads to a Bachelor of Science degree, and many graduates go on to study at civilian graduate schools. The faculty at West Point is composed almost entirely of regular Army officers, all of whom hold advanced degrees from the finest universities at home and abroad. Dr. Forrest C. Pogue, today's AEI lecturer, is the biographer of General George C. Marshall. He was given the Bronze Star and the Quadrigere for his service in World War II. He continues his lecture from West Point's Thayer Auditorium.
It was not surprising in the early mobilization of units, some of which elected their officers, to find men ignorant of military leadership in charge of some companies. A Hessian officer, sold to the British by his prince, confided to his diary that he'd seen an American officer mending boots. Even an American was shocked to see a militia officer shaving one of his men. But without military schools or standing army, the colonies had no pool of officers on which to draw in 1775, and they searched frantically for men with some military service, wherever required, and for those showing any natural gift for leadership, self-educated by a few military manuals obtained from Europe. However much the colonies recognized the need of trained officers, for the first years of the Revolution, their officer corps had to be largely improvised and trained in the field. The Continental Army had selected as its commander-in-chief a former orphan who had inherited his brother's estate and greatly increased its worth, but his military background had consisted only of a lieutenant colonelcy in the Virginia militia. In the British Army of that era, he might have reached the lesser command on the basis of his fortune, his fine horsemanship, and certain similarities to a British country gentleman, but not more. The British saw Charles Lee and Horatio Gates as officers who had gained a certain knowledge of their métier by service in British forces, but scarcely sufficient for command of a large force in battle. Grudging acceptance could be made of some of the foreigners, von Steuben, Pulaski, de Kalb, Kosciuszko, and the young and untried boy, as Cornwallis described the Marquis de Lafayette. Well, what of 33-year-old Nathaniel Greene, an iron forger, often ranked as one of the 3 best generals in the American forces? Of fat Henry Knox, who had learned his knowledge of artillery from the treatises on war stocked in his bookstore? Or Benedict Arnold, variously described as an apothecary's apprentice, a merchant in drugs and books, and smuggler in trade with the Caribbean islands. The books of John Alden and Don Higginbottom recall the success of those unlikely generals, fighting in familiar areas with men they had trained, unhampered by lessons of warfare which they had to forget, a strange assortment of commanders and a mixed bag of continentals and militia defeated the British plan for cutting off New England from the rest of the colonies and reducing the Hudson to a British thoroughfare. Stubborn Dutchmen summoned hurriedly against St. Leger, advancing from Oswego by way of Fort Stanwix to Albany. And tough John Stark inflicted heavy losses on British and Hessians at Bennington, while Dan Morgan and his riflemen made life miserable for Burgoyne's slowly advancing forces from Canada. Burgoyne, exhorting short shrift for American rebels, closing his eyes for political reasons to the revolting cruelties of his Indian allies, proved more the weary and cynical Gentleman Johnny of Shaw's play, mockingly begging an American prisoner to accept death by hanging rather than by shooting, in view of the British soldiers' noted inefficiency with the musket. He was much more that cynical gentleman than an executor of a grand design. A man of ability and of wit, he seemed never to learn to travel light in an area where normally difficult passage was made worse by the felling of trees in his path. He could charge much of his trouble to American use of Indian tactics. But General Howe's move toward Philadelphia, while Burgoyne was proceeding on his way to surrender at Saratoga, had no such excuse. The strategically important battle at Saratoga, helping to ensure the French Treaty of Alliance of February 1778, which promised additional munitions and men and ships, showed the ineptness of British 18th century generalship. Later in the month, as Cornwallis followed up the capture of Charleston and the advantage of British naval superiority in southern waters, the Colonial General Greene's careful movements drew the British general away from his bases, enticed him into actions where successes damaged him more than they did the Americans. At length, despairing of the southern theater, Cornwallis withdrew to Virginia and lingered all too long until American and French forces could trap him. Once the French fleet had arrived off the coast of Virginia and had won the Battle of the Capes, it was a matter of time until Washington's and Rochambeau's forces set the stage for the final decisive victory. Oddly enough, it was an 18th century type of siege in which Cornwallis's outnumbered defenders were methodically crushed. On October 19, 1781, he surrendered his forces at Yorktown. Not only the victory, but the legend gave to Washington a special standing in the minds of those who were soon to struggle or to dream of struggling for independence. Richard Morris, in 1970, in his The Emerging Nations and the American Revolution, has reminded us of the way in which Washington and the American Revolution caught the imagination of freedom seekers throughout the world. In a revolutionary transformation that inspired Europe and Latin America within his lifetime, and thereafter in emerging nations in Asia and the Far East. The very real leadership of the Virginia gentleman who overrode frustrations and failures and mistakes and even treason to outlast his opponents seemed transformed into the spirit of independence armed. The growing admiration of Washington's leadership was a natural reaction by proponents of independence, and initially without special effort on the part of American partisans. But it reflects also a type of conscious campaign which, in a sense, constituted the first modern and revolutionary use of demonstrations, caricatures, pamphlets, sermons, hymns to liberty, atrocity stories, real and imaginary, letters by committees of correspondence, proclamations and speeches designed to urge American freedom and to spread the doctrine of American independence. The promoters of the French Revolution would draw on these materials and on even earlier writings by men of the Enlightenment to attack the old regime in France and to press first for reform and then for international revolution. While properly belonging to the art of political attack, propaganda has a role in military warfare when used to aid recruitment, subvert opponents, and encourage the army in periods of frustration and despair. The inflammatory speeches of James Otis and the subversive pamphlets and letters of Sam Adams stirred early resistance to the acts of Parliament and the forces sent to Boston. Thomas Paine was among those who urged a break with Britain in order to attract the aid of foreign allies at a dreary part of the war. A few days before Washington crossed the Delaware, Paine raised the spirits of the soldiers by writing, "These are the times that try men's souls. The summer soldier and the sunshine patriot will in this crisis shrink from the service of his country, but he that stands it now deserves the love and thanks of men and women." Perhaps most timely of all, he insisted that the man who paid his taxes does more for his country than the loudest talker in America. Abroad, Franklin and his colleagues kept the French court astir with over-sanguine details of American good fortune, spiced with tales of depredations in America by the British and their German and Indian allies. Congress conducted a campaign of psychological warfare against the British by offering land and livestock to Hessian deserters. But the most effective document was the Declaration of Independence. Early American attacks, at a time when there was hope that the ties with Britain could be maintained, centered on Parliament. Now that the decision had been made for independence, George III became the focus for assault. Some grievances were those which his opponents in the Parliament had made. He'd kept standing armies in time of peace, hoarded large bodies of troops in America, rendered the military independent of and superior to the civil power. He was attacked for ravaging the coast, for sending foreign mercenaries, and stirring the barbarous savages to merciless warfare. These items were calculated to goad Americans to the final break. Its truly revolutionary preamble of the Declaration was reflected rather in the deliberations of the French revolutionary bodies and recurred in later revolutionary manifestos proclaiming the rights of men to oppose and overthrow oppressive kings and tyrants.
Dr. Forrest C. Pogue has been discussing the revolutionary transformation of the art of war from the United States Military Academy at West Point. In just one moment, he continues. A regular sight at West Point is the Military Academy band and the Corps of Cadets participating in some of the finest parades to be seen anywhere. Parade uniforms are those worn by the U.S. infantry during the War of 1812. The maneuvers now performed create an impressive spectacle, but they once had a deadly function in combat. The ability to form a long straight line meant that infantrymen could fire their weapons directly at the enemy without their fellow soldiers blocking the line of fire. And the ability to change direction rapidly while marching meant protection from attacks at the side or rear. Today, the Army feels that these drills furnish cadets with valuable training in discipline, teamwork, and command. The Military Academy band, incidentally, is not composed of cadets, but of professional musician soldiers. A military historian of world renown is Dr. Forrest C. Pogue, today's AEI lecturer. He now concludes his lecture from West Point's Thayer Auditorium.
The American colonists had refused to settle for anything less than victory. The French war revolutionists had no place for compromise nor negotiated peace. They demanded all-out victory. They opened the way for the tyranny of the armored horde and led, in some cases, to a dictator like Napoleon, ended by establishing a despotism in the name of liberty. The newer form of warfare required large armies, greater firepower, greater mobility, the use of forces that could be thrown into battle more easily, and new methods of supply. No longer would it be possible, as it was in the earlier armies of 40 to 50,000 men, to build space magazines of supplies along the line of maneuver so that the crops of the inhabitants would be avoided and the misery of war lessened. In the fast-charging, massive attacks now envisaged with hundreds of thousands of men, it would be essential to feed off the country. The army, along with greater mobility, also required better artillery, prepared to fire more rounds, capable of being handled more easily. European technology showed a means of building these weapons which would both increase the firepower and reduce its weight, making it possible for men to move about more easily in battle, thus increasing the gunner's ability to sight his weapon more readily and obtain better observed fire. No longer effective were the advances of infantry in long, well-dressed lines, depending on the effective movement and the shock of steel to carry positions. The emphasis shifted to strong columns, which could be launched at parts of an enemy's line in the hope of opening a breach which could be exploited. To turn the flanks, or to bring pressure on the flanks or rear of an opposing unit, the new armies made more effective use of cavalry, which had been rarely used in the American Revolution, except with small units, such as those developed by Tarleton in the South. The new tactics required soldiers who understood more of their job than the older soldiers had done. To get the men needed, national conscription was introduced. And to command these units, more highly trained officers of whatever backgrounds were demanded. Standing armies, which both British and Americans had deplored, were the order of the day in continental establishments. The colonists, having been a part of the revolutionary changes of the era, seemed, on gaining independence in 1783, to recoil from happenings overseas and turn to a life less part of Europe and Britain than in the period before the war. The army was virtually disbanded, and the navy, for which ships had been planned but not wholly completed, was also neglected. As a maritime power, the colonies were aware of the importance of sea power to the protection of commerce and to defense. Their own privateers had shown the damage which could be inflicted on unescorted merchant ships. The shifting battle between the British Navy and the combined fleets of France and Spain for control of American waters had made quite clear the dangers to which a people with a long, defenseless coastline could be exposed. But lack of money and lassitude following the long fight for independence seemed to make such action impossible. Thus, in America and in France and the parts of Europe touched by French democratic enthusiasm, or turned later by opposition to Napoleonic despotism to a burgeoning nationalism, the revolutionary impetus was to sweep away much that was feudal or semi-feudal in every phase of political and social life. In warfare, it meant the end of mercenaries, of armies based principally on the dregs of society, on officers who got their commands on the basis of birth or purchase. The end of the war found the leaders uncertain as to the type of national defense the colonists should establish. Less than a week before the formal conclusion of peace, Washington at Newburgh, not too far from here, called on 7 of his generals for suggestions for an effective scheme of defense. All of them, including von Steuben, agreed that American repugnance to a standing army, inherited from the British and reinforced by the recent actions of the British Army, made it necessary to depend basically on a well-regulated militia, uniform in organization and drill throughout the colonies. To protect the frontiers against Indian aggressions and encroachments of neighbors in Canada and the Floridas, Washington proposed a regular army of 2,687 officers and men, 4 small regiments of infantry, and 1 regiment of artillery. To prepare the officers needed for these units, he proposed that an academy be established at West Point. However, it was not until 1802, after Jefferson became president, that the United States Military Academy was finally established. To Washington's dismay, during his administration, Congress declined to implement his defensive system. General Marshall said many years later that he thought many problems of Washington and many of his successors lay in the myth of the Minuteman. They were still saying in 1970 and again in 1939 that all you have to do to prepare for defense is to take the musket from over the mantelpiece to be ready to defend the country. They also said every American is a woodsman. Even in 1917, he added, all the trees many Americans knew anything about were those in Central Park. Through the years that have followed, the United States has tried various expedients, such as full dependence on the militia, special calls for volunteers, strengthening of existing regular forces, formation of reserve officer units, establishment of a federally supervised system of units which in time of emergency could be federalized as National Guard divisions, and systems of national conscription. In Marshall's time, they attempted the system of universal military training, which he felt, and John Macaulay Palmer, who wrote many books on the subject, felt was the nearest thing that they could imagine to what Washington and his generals had in mind. The Draft Act was bitterly attacked in 1863 and assailed in the First and Second World Wars. But it has remained for the struggle in Vietnam to bring massive opposition to conscription. One must sympathize with political and military leaders as they experiment with an all-voluntary army concept in attempting to build an effective military force without creating a greater gap between the armed forces and many of the citizens of the state. Disagreements on the recent experiment are as intense in military circles and in the halls of Congress as in the country at large. But this state of disagreement is not new. Some years ago, when I reviewed Theodore Ropp's War in the Western World, I found a quotation from Leopold von Boyen, Prussian Minister of War, who helped to prepare the army of his country for effective opposition to Napoleon, concerning disagreements between some of his colleagues. I recently found it repeated in Stephen Ambrose's book on West Point, as he described General MacArthur's fight for reforms at the Academy after World War I. I have no desire in what I have to read here to apply the terms old school or new school invidiously, but I do feel that this quotation puts the problem in proper perspective. The old school places all its trust in the standing army, though on occasion it has to be complemented by a levy en masse. The modern school believes, on the contrary, that the country cannot be defended by a standing army alone, if only because of the expense which its upkeep imposes on the country. Because of this, it is necessary to have a numerous reserve, which ought to be given serious training and not to be regarded as entirely subsidiary to the regulars. The old school believes, and remember this is Prussia, that arbitrary authority and discipline alone make soldiers. The new school, that it's necessary for the army to follow changing civilian custom. The old school wishes to consider military questions without the participation of the public. The new school holds that the defense of the state is impossible without the material and moral cooperation of the entire nation. In considering these thorny problems of military service, I think it's vital to remember the earlier reference I made to John Stuart Mill's statement on the practice of citizenship. And we should recall again the statement made by Washington in justifying his proposal for a well-regulated militia. It may be laid down as a primary possession, he said, on the basis of our system that every citizen who enjoys the protection of a free government owes not only a portion of his property, but even of his personal services to the defense of it. The basic military lesson of the American Revolution was in learning the importance to a democracy of a well-trained army, representative of the whole people, and a properly trained officer corps drawn from all of American life. An army responsible to civilian authority and fully backed by it, capable of defending and expounding the principles for which the participants in the American Revolution risked their lives.
We've been listening to Dr. Forrest Carlisle Pogue discussing the revolutionary transformation of the art of war. Dr. Pogue examined some of the problems posed by an all-volunteer army and compared the military today with the military problems of the past. This has been one of several varied looks at present-day America presented by the American Enterprise Institute as part of its observance of the bicentennial of the United States. If you would like a copy of Dr. Pogue's lecture or of the entire series, write the American Enterprise Institute, that's AEI, Post Office Box 19191, Washington, D.C. 236. Until next time, this is Vermont Royster, and thank you for joining us.